Hey everyone, welcome back. This is video 3 of the American Revolution series, and we are going to go over slides 7 and 8 for this video. Okay, so we had talked about the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act in video 2, and now we're kind of going where we jump a couple of years and we are at 1770, and we're going to discuss the Boston Massacre. Okay, so prior to the Boston Massacre, protests and rebellions were not uncommon among the colonists. Okay, in fact, they were known to vandalize stores and other places of business known for selling British goods. This included intimidating store owners and customers. And also, a little less than a month prior to the Boston Massacre, a similar protest and vandalizing occurred. Rocks and other projectiles were being thrown by the protesters at a known loyalist store. And a British soldier who lived nearby tried to break up the situation by firing a shot through his living room window. Real good idea. Anyways, this stray shot killed an 11-year-old boy who was passing by. This would just further the fire, and people would become more enraged. Now, the colonial protesters were taunting the British soldiers guarding the customs house on the night of the Boston Massacre, or what would be called the Boston Massacre. And by taunting, they were calling names and throwing snowballs. And by snowballs, I'm talking about snowballs with rocks in them. They had clubs and other types of weapons. They were there to incite fear. They were there to get something done, okay? So it wasn't just like they just showed up there and something happened. They were planning for this protest, and they taunted the soldiers to the point of where it became violent. Now, initially, when the crowd marched to the customs house, there was only one soldier who was there. He was protecting the king's money, okay? And they overcame him pretty quickly. So he called for more soldiers to assist, partially to protect the first soldier, but mostly to protect the king's money. Okay, there was so much more commotion and chaos that no one really knows who the first shot was fired, how the first shot was fired, but it led to other soldiers firing as well. In the end, when the dust would settle, they would kill 5 colonists, and then they would also set the scene for both sides of the rebellion with lots of propaganda. So in the image in this slide, it shows the British commander right here, okay, in a position like he's commanding the troops to fire. But his version of the story was that he was trying to calm the situation, and he never asked his soldiers to fire. Okay, now this image was propaganda used by the colonials or the rebellious group, and it was painted by, or it was actually an engraving, a silver engraving by Paul Revere. Okay, and this would further enrage colonists more than they had already been, and this would kind of be like similar to a tipping point for them to get them on their side that the British needed to go. Okay. So just understand that the Boston Massacre, as it's labeled and as we know it today, was really a big propaganda stint on both sides of the rebellion. In fact, the British probably didn't use it as well as the Americans did, and that's how the Americans were able to get a lot of people on their side, okay? So moving on to slide 8, we are going to the Boston Tea Party, which is in 1773. So it's 3 years later than the Boston Massacre. Now keep in mind the Land Proclamation Act of 1763 occurred 10 years before. So this is slow rebellion building up. Nothing happens overnight, so to speak, okay? So in the Boston Tea Party, it was originally a political protest. This was the first major act of defiance that the colonists did against Britain. Tea was a favorite beverage of colonists and the British alike. Okay, it's still a huge drink that's favored in Britain. And the Americans, it's still a pretty good drink that most Americans like, but not nearly the same way. It would be the equivalent of today's United States in the way we look at soda or coffee, okay? The boycotts of the British goods caused the British East India Company, which was the company that was importing tea, to lose so much revenue. Okay, now to help prevent the bankruptcy of the British East India Company, taxes were imposed by the British government, on all other tea companies except the British East India Company. Now, this was really going to hurt colonial merchants. Okay, they could not compete with the much cheaper tea. Why would they buy from? Why would colonists buy from merchants, American merchants, when the imported tea, which was just as good, was a lot cheaper? Okay, and this created a market again for tea smuggling instead of molasses smuggling. Now, John Hancock, who is the big signature on the Declaration of Independence, and Sam Adams were major smugglers. I know that we don't talk a lot about that in our textbooks, but they were major smugglers. And really, when you start to get down to protests and when you start to get down to defiance, we're really looking at how is it hitting somebody personally, whether it's in their pocketbook, whether it's their property, whatever the case is. This is when you start to really see people come out of their apathy, okay? So major players of the coordination of the protests came from the secret group, the Sons of Liberty. This included Paul Revere, who did that silver sketching, Sam Adams, John Hancock, Benedict Arnold, who would later become America's first and most notorious traitor. And I would love to get into more about him later on, because I kind of think his story is a little bit tragic. And then, of course, Patrick Henry. So these are some major names that we've heard before. Maybe you don't recognize them completely because you don't remember them, but they are major players in the founding of the United States. Now, there were 3 ships in the harbor that day, okay? And these ships that were holding the tea by the British East India Company were built by Americans and owned by Americans. Now, when they docked in the harbor, the British governor ordered the tax to be paid and the cargo to be taken off the ship. The colonists said, no way, we're not paying that. We're not doing that. We're not going to take it off the ship. Well, the governor didn't offer a compromise. So the plan took root that they were going to climb aboard that ship in the evening. Okay. Now, they were dressed as Mohawk Indians. And the reason for being dressed that way was to be in a disguise. Okay. Now, understand as well that when they went onto the ship, they had tomahawks and things of that nature. They cut open the crates to make sure that when they dumped that tea into the harbor, the tea would be absorbed into the sea, okay? So this was going to create a huge issue. A lot of people were waking up that morning to the smell of tea in the harbor, and it full of tea leaves everywhere. Now, we're not talking about little sachets of tea. We're talking about tea leaves, okay, raw tea leaves that were just thrown into the harbor. Now, this group of men were able to get all the crates of, out into the harbor, which equivalent to today's money was probably about $1 million worth of profits, okay? So they were able to get that money into the harbor, but they were so nice. They cleaned up the ship. They, made sure that there wasn't any tea leaves on the actual ship itself when they disembarked. In fact, nobody really knows who was a part of that scheme because it was such a tightly held secret. Only one of the natives was caught, and he refused to talk. He was imprisoned, but he refused to talk about what was going on, okay? So it worked. It was going to incite a lot of anger. As well, it was going to incite a lot of cheering from the colonists and anger on the British side. So we'll get into more about that in video 4 with slides 9 and 10. But just to give you an idea of how the Boston Tea Party occurred, it wasn't really planned that way. It was just that after the governor gave them no compromises on what they were going to do with this tea, at some point somebody said something. They think that it might have been Sam Adams that said something like, well, there's no other further way we're going to get through with this. So that was the sign to go onto the boats that night, dump the tea, and then hide in the darkness. And that was their first real act of defiance against the British government by dumping the tea, losing all that profit, and the government was going to end up losing their taxes on the imports, okay? So I hope that helped you between the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party to understand a little bit more as tensions were rising throughout this period of time. And we'll get into more in the next video. Okay, so if you have any questions, comments, concerns, You know to email me, text me, call me, as well as questions. Please put them in the Schoology discussion board and we can go over them as a class. I would love to be able to have more of a discussion in Schoology. All right, I will talk to you later. Thanks.